Cowboy Tycoon plays, dead asleep, in bed, to watch his maid, and freezes. When she moves closer, the cavernous heart of the Croft cattle empire exuded immense wealth, profound emptiness, and a bitter, coiling suspicion. From the shadows of his mahogany-lined study, Nathaniel Beauregard Croft watched the new maid, Eliza May. Her movements were quiet, almost ghostly, as she dusted the artifacts of a life he no longer felt he lived. Every soul who entered this house was a potential viper, another hired hand ready to strike. He'd learned that lesson the hard way. His hand instinctively went to the cold locket in his waistcoat, a ghost of the trust he had buried alongside his wife. This girl, Eliza, with her downcast eyes and timid spirit. She was no different. He was sure of it. Tonight, he would lay a trap. He would play the drunken fool dead to the world and force her to show her true colors. He would finally prove that every soul had its price. Because in this harsh, unforgiving land, you didn't wait for a rattler to warn you. You made it strike, and what he discovered in the dead of night would shatter everything he thought he knew. The fire crackled a lonely sound in the cavernous study. It threw dancing shadows across the spines of 100 leather-bound books he never read and glinted off the rim of the whiskey glass in his hand. The silence in the room was a living thing, thick with the ghosts of unspoken words, and the cloying scent of a fortune that had cost him everything but the dirt beneath his boots. Trust was a fool's currency, and he was a wealthy man. A heavy, confident knock echoed from the study door before it swung open. Bartholomew Barty Graves stepped inside, his hat held respectfully in his hands, but his eyes held a familiar reptilian gleam. His foreman, the only man Nathaniel almost trusted, mostly because Barty's greed was predictable. Boss Barty began, his voice a low gravel. Just wanted to report. The count from the north pasture is solid. Lost one calf to a coyote, but that's the cost of business. Nathaniel swirled the amber liquid in his glass, not looking at him. The cost of business. He repeated the words, tasting like ash. Always a cost, Barty. Barty shifted his weight, his gaze flicking around the opulent room, before landing on the doorway where the faint sound of Eliza's sweeping could be heard down the hall. That new girl. The May girl, Barty said, his tone casual, a fisherman casting a line. She's a quiet one, barely a shadow. He paused, letting the silence stretch. Sometimes, the quiet ones are the ones you gotta watch. Remember that last girl, the one who swore she was honest as the day is long, walked off with your good silver cufflinks. The memory was a splinter under Nathaniel's skin. He grunted a sound of dismissal that didn't quite hide the flicker of agreement in his eyes. He knew Barty was goading him, feeding the very beast of suspicion that gnawed at his gut. But the foreman was right. He had been made a fool of before. Never again. I'm aware of my staff, Graves, Nathaniel said, his voice cold iron. Is that all? Yes, sir. Just looking out for you. Barty tipped his head and backed out of the room, leaving his poison to seep into the air. Nathaniel stared into the fire, the foreman's words fanning the flames of his own bitter resolve. The plan for tonight, once a cruel whim, now felt like a necessary defense, a fortification of his soul. He would not be blindsided again. He would be the one holding the whip. He rang a small silver bell on his desk, the chime sharp and imperious. A moment later, Eliza appeared at the door, her hands clasped before her, her eyes fixed on the floor. Sir, her voice was a bare whisper. Whiskey, he commanded, gesturing to the crystal decanter. She moved with a quiet efficiency that grated on his nerves. He watched her every move, searching for a sign, a flicker of avarice in her eyes, a hint of the deceit he knew lay coiled beneath that timid facade. But he saw nothing. Nothing but a disciplined fear. Or was it something else? As she poured the drink, her hand trembled just slightly. A drop of whiskey splashed onto the polished wood of the desk. Her breath hitched. "Forgive me, sir," she whispered quickly, dabbing at the spot with her sleeve. Nathaniel said nothing. He just stared, his gaze a physical weight. He saw her flinch, and a savage, ugly part of him felt a grim satisfaction. Fear was a language he understood. Later, as the sun bled out across the vast, lonely plains, he sat for dinner in the echoing dining hall. Alone. He made a show of it, draining his glass again and again, letting his movements become slightly exaggerated, his words to the cook slurred just enough to be convincing. The stage was set. He stumbled from the dining room into the library, clutching the decanter. He made his way to the large leather armchair by the fire, the one where he had spent 1,000 nights drowning his ghosts. He let his body slump into it, his head lolling back. And as he did, he let his fingers go limp, allowing the locket to slip from his waistcoat and fall, its gold chain landing with a soft, almost inaudible clink upon the dark wood of the floor. It lay there, a small, glittering pool of memory in the firelight. Perfect. He closed his eyes, slowing his breathing, every muscle in his body tensed and waiting. He was no longer a rancher. He was a hunter lying in wait. And in the oppressive silence of the house he heard them, the soft, hesitant footsteps approaching down the hall. She was coming to clear the room. The test had begun. The footsteps were a whisper against the floorboards. Hesitant. Soft. The sound of a mouse or a thief. From his feigned slumber, Nathaniel Croft listened, his entire being coiled into a single sharp point of anticipation. He tracked her progress by the subtle shift of air in the vast, silent house, a soft rustle of calico, the faint scent of lye soap and wood smoke that clung to her. She was in the room now. Here we are, he thought, a bitter triumph, already curdling in his gut, the little church mouse come to nibble at the sleeping giant's gold. He kept his breathing deep, and even a slow, rumbling cadence that mimicked a drunken stupor. A muscle in his jaw twitched. Through the thin veil of his eyelashes, he saw a blurred shape moving in the firelight. She picked up his discarded whiskey glass, her movements deft and silent. He heard the faint clink as she placed it on a silver tray. Good. The perfect, dutiful maid. The perfect cover. Then she stopped. The silence stretched thin and taut as a wire. He knew what she had seen. The locket, lying there on the floor, a single golden tear in the shadows. He felt his own heart hammer against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the slow rhythm of his false sleep. He waited for the rustle of her dress as she knelt, the furtive movement as she snatched it from the floor, the quiet slide as she secreted it away in a hidden pocket. Come on, show me the viper. Show me who you really are. She knelt, but it was not the hurried, greedy motion he expected. It was a slow, graceful descent, the movement of someone paying respect. He risked a sliver of vision. He saw her small, work-roughened hand reach out and gently, so gently lift the locket from the floor. She didn't rise. She stayed there, a small, still figure in the flickering gloom, cradling the gold in her palm as if it were a wounded bird. He watched, his mind a storm of confusion, as she used a clean corner of her apron to wipe away an imaginary speck of dust from its polished surface. It was an act of reverence. His breath caught in his throat. Her thumb found the small hidden clasp. With a soft click, the locket opened. A raw, possessive rage surged through Nathaniel. How dare she? How dare this stranger gaze upon the face of his Sarah, the memory he had locked away from the world, the one piece of his heart that was not for sale, not for anyone. He was about to betray his ruse, to roar at her, to rip the sacred object from her unworthy hands. But he was frozen, because he saw her face. In the warm, wavering light of the fire, he saw not the calculation of a thief assessing value, but an expression of profound, heart-wrenching empathy. A deep, sorrowful understanding flowed from her, a quiet acknowledgement of the beautiful, smiling woman in the miniature portrait. She was not looking at a piece of gold. She was looking at a tragedy. She looked at the portrait for a long, silent moment. A moment that felt like a lifetime. Then, with that same impossible gentleness, she clicked the locket shut. She rose to her feet. Nathaniel tensed again. Now. She will take it now. She was only making sure it was real, but she did not move toward the door. She moved toward the fireplace. She reached up and carefully, deliberately placed the locket on the heavy oak mantelpiece, propping it against a silver candlestick. She centered it a place of honor where the firelight would catch it where it could be seen, where it would not be forgotten on the floor. Nathaniel's mind went silent. The angry, cynical voice in his head, the one that had been his only companion for years, was utterly gone. There was only a vast, ringing emptiness. As if that weren't enough, she turned. She saw the heavy wool blanket folded over the back of the nearby divan. She picked it up. She was approaching him. He could feel the warmth of her presence. He could smell the clean, honest scent of her clothes. He braced himself for he didn't know what. A touch, a whisper. She carefully, quietly draped the blanket over his body, tucking it around his shoulders. Her fingers brushed against the sleeve of his shirt, a touch so light it was barely there. Yet it seared him like a branding iron. It was a touch devoid of guile of want. It was simple, human kindness, a thing he had forgotten existed. She finished her work, gathered her tray, and slipped from the room, leaving behind only the soft scent of wood smoke and the echo of her silent grace. The fire crackled on. The locket gleamed from the mantel. The blanket was a heavy, warm weight upon his chest. But Nathaniel Beauregard Croft had never felt so cold or so naked in his entire life. The test was over, and he was the one who had failed. For a long time, Nathaniel Croft did not move. He sat in the armchair, the warmth of the wool blanket a searing indictment against the coldness of his soul. The fortress he had built around his heartstone by bitter stone had not been stormed. It had been dismantled by a whisper, by a gesture, by a kindness so profound it felt like a violence. He was a man who understood battles, ambushes, and betrayals. He did not understand this. He finally rose, his joints stiff, and walked to the mantel. The locket gleamed its gold, catching the firelight. His Sarah. For the first time in years, he did not see her face and feel the sharp, familiar stab of loss. He saw her through another's eyes, a memory to be honored, not a wound to be guarded. He picked it up, its weight familiar in his palm, and slipped it back into his waistcoat. It felt different now. Heavier. The shame was a physical thing, a sickness in his gut. The test was over, and he was the one who had failed. The next morning, the sun rose over a changed world. Or perhaps it was only Nathaniel who had changed. He came down for breakfast, and for the first time in years, the household staff felt a shift in the oppressive atmosphere. The master's usual thunderous silence was replaced by a strange, watchful stillness. Eliza entered the dining hall carrying the silver coffee pot, her eyes, as always, cast downward. She moved to his side, her presence a faint scent of fresh laundry and morning air. He watched her hand as she poured, noting the steadiness that had replaced the tremble from the night before. He had terrified her. The thought was a fresh splinter in his conscience. As she turned to leave, he spoke. "Miss May." The words hung in the air, foreign and loud in the silent room. She froze her back to him as if expecting a blow. Slowly, she turned her face pale, her eyes wide with a sort of frightened curiosity. He cleared his throat, the words feeling clumsy in his mouth. "The fire in the library." He set his gaze fixed on a point just past her shoulder. "It was well tended last night." "Thank you." A faint blush bloomed on her cheeks. It was the first sign of color he had ever seen on her. She seemed utterly lost for a response, a small stunned bird. "You are welcome, sir." She stammered before turning and fleeing the room, her composure shattered by a single, simple courtesy. Nathaniel stared at the empty doorway, a strange, unfamiliar feeling stirring in his chest. It was not triumph. It was not pity. It was a fragile, terrifying flicker of something else. Hope. From the shadowed archway leading to the kitchens, Barty Graves watched the exchange, his eyes narrowed to slits. He saw the master's softened gaze. He saw the girl's flustered retreat. And he felt the solid ground beneath his feet begin to shift. Later he found Nathaniel by the corral watching the wranglers break a wild stallion. The air was full of dust and the shouts of men, a world of brute force Nathaniel understood. "Mornin', Boss Bart," he said, sidling up to the fence. "You seem in better spirits today." It was a question disguised as an observation. Nathaniel did not take his eyes off the horse. "The air is clear." Barty spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. "That May girl seems to be settling in." He probed, his voice slick. "Still too quiet for my taste. Makes a man wonder what she's thinking. But she does her work." Nathaniel turned his head, his gaze finally meeting his foreman's. It was a cold, flat stare, devoid of its usual shared cynicism. "She does her work, Graves," he said, his voice level. "That is all that is required. See to the branding. I will handle the affairs of the house." It was a dismissal, a wall raised between them where there had once been a conspiratorial understanding. Barty's smile tightened, but he nodded. "Yes, sir. Of course, boss." He tipped his hat and walked away, but the mask of respect fell the moment his back was turned, replaced by a look of cold, calculating fury. He had felt the change. The master was no longer listening to his whispers. That girl, that nobody had somehow slipped past the guards, past the walls, and was planting her own seeds in the master's mind. And Barty knew what happened when a man like Croft started thinking for himself. He started looking closer. He started asking questions. He might even start checking the ledgers. Barty stopped by the water trough watching Eliza cross the yard carrying a basket of linens. A small, unassuming creature who had in a single night undone years of his careful, patient work. A simple test had failed to expose a thief. Very well. Barty Graves would have to devise a new one. A test she couldn't possibly pass. A trap from which there would be no escape. The days that followed were steeped in a strange and fragile quiet. The brutal, jagged edges of life at the Croft Ranch seemed to soften. Nathaniel found himself observing, not just commanding. He watched Eliza May as she moved through the great, lonely house, a whisper of diligence. He saw the way she would pause to straighten a crooked painting, the gentle hand she used to tend the wilting rosebush by the porch, the quiet reverence she held for the house itself. These were not the actions of a person merely earning a wage. This was the work of someone who cared. A ghost of a thought, one he hadn't had in years, began to haunt him. Perhaps he had been wrong. Not just about her, about everything. One afternoon he found her in the library, her work finished, her hand hovering just above a thick, leather-bound book of poetry. She did not touch it as if the very idea were a transgression. She simply looked, her expression one of deep, unfulfilled longing. The next day he left the same book on a small table in the main hall, left open to a page about the changing seasons. He said nothing of it, but later from his study he saw her find it. He watched as she read the page, a slow, secret smile gracing her lips before she dutifully closed it and moved on. The small silent exchange was more profound than any conversation he'd had in a decade. The thaw, however, did not go unnoticed. The serpent in his garden was watching too. "Payroll's ready to be counted, boss." Barty Graves announced one evening, placing the heavy iron lockbox on the polished surface of Nathaniel's desk. "Heavy one this month. With the new hands for the branding, the men'll be expectin' a full purse." Nathaniel nodded, his mind elsewhere. He unlocked the box and his safe, his hands moving through the familiar ritual with a distracted air. He counted the stacks of coins and bills, his gaze occasionally drifting to the window where Eliza was watering the roses as dusk settled over the plains. "Looks right," Nathaniel said, shoving the money into the safe and slamming the heavy door shut, the tumblers clicking into place with a sound of finality. Barty lingered. "Good thing we got honest folk in the house, boss," he said, his voice smooth as riverstone. "With that much cash lying around, it'd be a temptation for weaker souls." The words were a stone dropped into a still pond, the ripples spreading through the room long after he had gone. A warning. Or a threat. Later that night, Nathaniel sat by the fire, the locket open in his hand. He wasn't looking at the portrait, but at the faint, almost invisible smudge on the gold where Eliza's thumb had polished it. He was trying to reconcile the man he had been with the man he felt himself becoming. "Sir," he looked up. Eliza stood in the doorway, a fresh log for the fire cradled in her arms. She saw the locket, and a flicker of recognition, and perhaps fear, crossed her face before she quickly looked away. "Put it on the hearth, please," he said, his voice softer than he intended. She did as she was told, her movements quick and quiet. As she rose to leave, he heard himself speak the question, taking him by surprise as much as it did her. "Miss May, where is your family from?" She stopped her hand on the doorframe. She was silent for so long he thought she would not answer. "Just me and my ma for a long while, sir," she finally said, her voice a low murmur aimed at the floor. "Up in the territories. She's gone now. It's just me." Her words were simple, unadorned, yet they carried the familiar aching weight of loss. He saw a flash of his own profound loneliness reflected in this quiet, unassuming girl. He in his mansion of grief. She in her small, solitary world. For a fleeting moment they were not master and maid. They were merely two souls adrift on the same vast, empty plain. He simply nodded. "Good night, Miss May." "Good night, sir." She disappeared, leaving him alone with the fire, the locket, and a connection he could no longer deny. The next day the storm broke. Barty Graves burst into the study without knocking, his face a perfect mask of theatrical panic. "Boss, the safe?" he yelled, his voice cracking with false urgency. "It's open, the payroll, it's gone." Nathaniel was on his feet in an instant, the old, cold dread washing over him. He shoved past Barty and stared at the safe. The heavy iron door was ajar. Inside there was nothing but empty canvas bags. A fortune. Vanished. The foreman's words came in a rush. "I came in to get the ledgers, and I found it just like this. I looked everywhere, searched the whole damn room." He stopped, his eyes falling to the floor beside the heavy desk. He bent down. "What? What's this?" He stood up, holding something small between his thumb and forefinger. He held it out to Nathaniel. It was a small plain button of dark worn wood identical to the ones on the simple gray dress Eliza wore every day. I didn't want to believe it," Boss Barty whispered, his voice laced with feigned sorrow. "But I found this. Right here. By the safe. It's hers. The quiet one's. Just like I said." Nathaniel stared at the button in his foreman's hand. The proof. It was so small, so simple, so undeniable. And yet all he could see was the memory of a girl's gentle hands polishing his wife's locket, her eyes full of a sorrow that could never belong to a thief. Barty was waiting for the storm, for the familiar, destructive rage. But something else was brewing in the heart of Nathaniel Croft. Not rage. Nathaniel held the small wooden button in his palm. The proof. It was solid. It was tangible. It was a lie. He could feel its falsehood, a cold, dead weight in his hand that was nothing like the warm, living gold of the locket. He looked from the button to the face of his foreman, a face etched with a perfect, practiced concern. And for the first time Nathaniel saw the man, not the mask. He saw the predator patiently waiting for its poison to work. A younger Nathaniel, the man from a week ago, would have already been roaring. He would have seized the girl, shaken the truth from her, and thrown her out into the unforgiving dust. But that man had died in an armchair, in the dead of night, with the phantom weight of a stranger's kindness on his shoulders. The silence in the study grew heavy, suffocating. Barty's victorious smirk began to falter, replaced by a flicker of confusion at his master's unnatural calm. "Get her," Nathaniel said. His voice was flat, devoid of all emotion. It was the voice of a hanging judge, not a wronged man. Barty hesitated for a second, unsettled, then a grin returned to his face. He had won. "Right away, boss." He hurried from the room, eager to deliver the sacrificial lamb. Alone, Nathaniel walked to the safe. He ran a finger along the cold steel edge of the door. Barty was right about one thing. It was sloppy. The scuff marks in the thick dust near the hinges were clumsy, the marks of a man in a hurry. And the safe itself, the lock was unscratched. Not the work of a panicked amateur. It was opened by someone who knew how. Someone with a key. The old instincts, the ones that had helped him build an empire and survive a dozen cattle wars, came flooding back. But this time they were not clouded by grief. They were sharp, they were clear, and they were pointed like a gun directly at his loyal foreman. The door flew open. Barty shoved Eliza May into the room, his hand rough on her arm. "Here she is, boss," he announced, his voice booming with false righteousness. "The little thief. Stole you blind while you slept." Eliza stumbled, catching herself on the edge of the desk. She was trembling, her face ashen with terror. Her eyes darted from the open safe to Barty's triumphant sneer, and finally to Nathaniel's cold, unreadable face. Her expression was not one of guilt. It was one of pure, uncomprehending fear. It was the look of a doe in a trap. "Sir, I don't," she stammered, her voice a broken whisper. "I swear." Barty stepped forward, holding the button out like a trophy. "And left this behind right by the safe?" Sloppy. Nathaniel took the button. He did not look at Barty. He looked at Eliza. He walked toward her, and she flinched, bracing for an accusation for the rage she had seen him direct at so many others. He stopped directly in front of her. His voice, when he spoke, was dangerously quiet. "You're right, Graves. It is sloppy." He reached out, and for a terrifying second she thought he meant to strike her. Instead, his fingers went to the front of her simple gray dress, to the spot just below the collar where a single button was missing, the threads hanging loose. So sloppy, Nathaniel continued, his eyes still locked on Eliza's. But his words, a verdict aimed at the man behind him, that a girl who spends her days sewing darning socks and mending linens for this entire ranch would have fixed a loose button the moment she noticed it. She would never have let it fall. He let his hand drop. He finally turned his whole body, now facing his foreman. Barty's smug expression had frozen, melting into a waxy mask of disbelief. "You also said you found the safe open." Nathaniel said, his voice a low, lethal hum. But this lock wasn't forced, it was opened with a key. He took a deliberate step toward the foreman, who instinctively took a step back. "Tell me, Barty, for the last 5 years, who has held the only other key to this safe for emergencies?" The blood drained from Barty's face. He was caught. "Now hold on, boss." He blustered, his voice losing its confidence. "You can't think. After all I've done for you, done for me." Nathaniel's voice rose a cold, controlled fury that was far more terrifying than his old blind rage. "Or done to me, the cufflinks, the missing saddle, the payroll shortages you always blamed on miscounts, or some poor drifter you'd run off the property the day before. The pieces were all there, a long, ugly chain of deceit he had been too lost in his own grief to see. All this time, you've been the loyal voice in my ear, the watchful dog, pointing out the splinters in everyone else's eyes to hide the damn forest in your own. The trap had not been for the girl. It had been for him. and he had almost walked right into it. The mask of the loyal servant finally fell, revealing the cornered rat beneath. Barty's eyes darted around the room, searching for an escape for a weapon. With a snarl, he lunged, not for the door, but for the heavy iron poker resting by the hearth. The quiet war of whispers was over. The war of blood and iron had just begun. The room exploded into savage motion. Barty lunged the iron poker, swinging in a vicious arc meant to shatter bone. There was no time for thought, only the primal instinct of a man who had survived ambushes and stampedes. Nathaniel threw himself sideways, the poker crashing against the solid oak of his desk, gouging a deep scar in the wood. Splinters flew. Eliza screamed a sharp, terrified sound that cut through the violence and hit Nathaniel like a physical blow. He saw her pressed into the far corner of the room, her face a mask of white terror. She was the reason this was happening. She was the fragile hope in the center of this storm, and he would not let the storm consume her. He was not a young man, but the rage that filled him now was pure, clarifying fire. It burned away the years of whiskey-soaked lethargy, leaving only hard muscle and harder resolve. As Barty raised the poker for another strike, Nathaniel kicked the heavy armchair he'd just vacated directly into the foreman's path. Barty roared in frustration as he stumbled, his blow going wide. It was the opening Nathaniel needed. He didn't have a weapon. He was the weapon. He closed the distance and drove his shoulder hard into Barty's midsection. The air left the foreman's lungs in a pained whoosh. The poker clattered to the floor. The two men crashed against a towering bookshelf. Books rained down around them, histories, philosophies, poetry, the forgotten knowledge of a better world becoming ammunition in a base, brutal struggle. Barty was stronger, but Nathaniel was fueled by a fury born of shame and a desperate need for redemption. He fought not for his money, but for the quiet girl in the corner who had shown him that a soul was worth more than a safe full of gold. He landed a solid blow to Barty's jaw. The man staggered back, his eyes wild with hate, and scrambled for the fallen poker. But Nathaniel was faster. He seized a heavy leather-bound volume from the floor Meditations by Marcus Aurelius and brought it down with all his force on Barty's outstretched hand. A sickening crack echoed in the room, followed by a howl of pure agony. Barty cradled his broken fingers, his face contorted in pain and defeat. The fight was over. Nathaniel stood over him, his chest heaving the chaos of the room, a reflection of the war that had just ended within his soul. He looked at the sniveling, broken man on the floor. He felt no pity, only a vast, cleansing emptiness. "Get out!" Nathaniel rasped, his voice ragged but carrying the unshakable weight of command. "Take your horse, your saddle, and whatever you can carry. Be gone by sunrise." He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a lethal whisper. "If I ever see your face on my land again, I will put you in the ground myself." There was no arguing with the promise in his eyes. Barty Graves, clutching his shattered hand, scrambled to his feet and fled, a disgraced ghost, vanishing from the house he had haunted for too long. Silence. The adrenaline faded, leaving only the sound of two people breathing in the wrecked study. Nathaniel leaned heavily on the scarred desk, the strength draining from him. He slowly turned to face Eliza. She was still in the corner, her eyes wide, watching him, not with fear, but with a kind of awe. Now came the harder part. The confession. Miss May, he began, the name sounding formal, absurd. Eliza. He took a ragged breath. That night, in this room, I wasn't drunk. He laid the truth bare, each word a stone of shame he placed at her feet. He told her of the test, the locket, his ugly, corrosive suspicion. He didn't offer excuses or ask for pity. He simply gave her the unvarnished, wretched truth of who he had been. I was a bitter, broken man, he finished, unable to meet her gaze. I no longer believed there was any goodness left in the world. I set a trap for you, expecting to find a thief. He finally looked at her, his eyes full of a pain that went deeper than any physical blow. "And you proved me a fool." She listened, her expression slowly shifting from shock to a deep, quiet understanding. When he was done, she did not recoil. She did not weep. She took a small step forward. "You were grieving, sir," she said, her voice a soft balm on his raw nerves. "Sometimes grief makes people build walls, just to see who cares enough to look over them." Her grace was a thing that shattered him more completely than the fight had. She saw the wound behind the weapon. She offered not judgment, but a pardon he had not earned. He looked around the ruined study at the scattered books and broken furniture. This place, this life, it's been a tomb. He looked back at her, at the quiet light in her eyes. "You brought life back into it. I don't want a maid Eliza. I want a partner. To help me run this ranch. To help me rebuild." He gestured to the mess, but he was talking about his life. "If you'll have it." It was a clumsy proposal, born of desperation and a dawning, terrifying hope. A slow, genuine smile, the first he had ever truly seen, bloomed on her face. A single, simple nod. "I would like that, Nathaniel." The use of his first name was an answer, a promise. The sun was beginning to stream through the large study window, cutting through the dust motes dancing in the air. The long night was over. The house was still vast, the land still wild. But for the first time in a lifetime, it did not feel empty. The ghost of Sarah was at peace, and the heart of Nathaniel Croft, scarred and battered, was finally quietly beginning to heal.